Michigan is a critical swing state on the front lines in the fight for democracy. I'm joined by Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson to discuss how Michigan is working to protect voting rights and elections this fall. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Secretary Benson, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I have been so looking forward to talking to you. As you know, you are very busy, but I've been really looking forward to talk to you because you are sitting literally at ground zero in the battleground of all battleground states. It's not just a presidential election that you have to oversee. There is a very close U.S. Senate election that you have to oversee. There are congressional elections that you have to oversee. You're probably going to tell me there are state and local elections also on the ballot that you have to oversee. So as a critical, and I hate to use the word swing state because, like I said, it conveys only one election, but as a critical state right now, what is your sort of top line message to people about where we stand in the election administration cycle in the fight for protecting democracy?
Well, really excited to be here with you. I think, where we stand in this moment is we're incredibly prepared and more aligned as a community of democracy defenders than we were at any point prior. I mean, at this stage in 2020, we had some inkling of how far, the former president might go when his, team to undermine elections or delegitimize democracy. But it really, the depths to which they would go really unfolded in a shocking way, leading up to, of course, the tragedy at our U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And so now at this stage of the subsequent presidential cycle in 24, we're very clear-eyed about what we're up against. It is a far more sophisticated effort than perhaps in 20. But at the same time, we are far more, for lack of better words, sophisticated as well. We're much more wizened and seasoned and coordinated. And we've got great people in place, not just in Michigan, but in several other key states like Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, even in Georgia. So I feel like we're fully aware of the battle that we're heading into. And I think voters, too, are more aware. So I think the story of these last several years, and my hope is the story that's yet to be written about the months ahead, will be one of all of us, the vast majority of citizens and election officials who care about democracy and want to see it survive, really banding together and protecting that basic promise of one person, one vote, and that the electors choose the president, not the other way around. All of that is going to continue to rule the day because people in this moment stood up and ensured that it did.
Well, so I want to get into all of that, but I have to start with a question I usually ask guests, but your background is really extraordinary. How did you decide to get into this? How did you decide, what I want to do is become a lawyer and, do this stuff and then become a law school dean and then run for Secretary of State? How do you tell people, how did you wind up being at the middle of ground zero in administering elections in a key swing state?
Yeah, my parents were special education teachers. And so I was raised in sort of an understanding that we all have a responsibility to play to make sure everyone has opportunity in our country. And that led me to want to do civil rights work, and in particular in Alabama, where I moved after college to investigate extremist organizations for the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it was really being so close to Selma and spending time in Selma where I was really instilled with this both inspiration and also recognition that the heart of the civil rights movement, for all the work and dismantling segregation and all the rest, it really lied with the Voting Rights Act. I mean, that preserving the Voting Rights Act would be how we could preserve all of the other freedoms and opportunities promised and gained in that movement and throughout history. So I wanted to become a lawyer just because the Voting Rights Act, even at that point in the late 90s, had been so weakened. I wanted to make it strong and be a part of reauthorizing Section 5 in 2000, in the early 2000s and all of that. And then the 2000 election happened. And that really underscored to me how, even though it was 24 years ago, a Secretary of State named Katherine Harris in Florida did not allow a full recount. I know you remember this quite well. Yep. Did not allow a full recount to happen. And I realized that that attorneys were just one piece of the puzzle, that election administrators as well have a key role to play to make sure we're proactively setting up systems to make democracy work for everyone. And then I even saw the Voting Rights Act was really about correcting for election officials who did the wrong thing and
Mhm.
compelling them to do the right thing. And so I thought, well, what if I could just be an election official and do all the right things? And then I was really inspired by the fact that voters, we choose these folks, particularly in Michigan and in Nevada and Arizona. So I wanted to, and this is why I wrote a book on secretaries of
Mhm.
state, to communicate to voters, like, you get to choose who these people are in most scenarios, and these are really critical positions. And I was so inspired writing that book that after I interviewed Jennifer Bruner, my last interview for the book, really just said to her, I think I want to do this job as well. And that began the process of planning to run for it. And I was very fortunate to be able to run in 2018 with a team of women in Michigan, like Dana Nessel, our amazing AG, and of course, Governor Whitmer, to really be part of an effort of women to lead our state and then be ready when the storm came our way in that Donald Trump presidency, we were on guard and prepared for that moment in different ways throughout our careers.
And Jennifer Bruner was the Secretary of State of Ohio, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Jennifer Bruner was, I think, the last Democrat to serve as Secretary of State in Ohio, in 2008.
Correct.
And yeah. Hmm.
And correct. And I was going to say, and you were the first Democrat to serve as Secretary of State in Michigan since
Since the 90s.
1995.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk a little bit, and then we'll get back to election administration. But you had quite a meteoric rise and success in politics, and have been a key player. Let's be clear, electorally, as you say, as part of three women statewide who won together. Democrats have both U.S. Senate seats. One of the Senate seats is up for election this cycle. And Democrats control both branches of the legislature for the first time in some time. And so I'm just curious, what do you know? What do you know about the secret to Michigan political success that others can learn from?
Yeah, it all starts with just empowering voters, because really what happened in Michigan after 2016, where voter turnout was lower than it has been since, was voters, citizens said, we're not going to take it anymore. And they started, among other things, like an initiative process through Voters Not Politicians to eliminate gerrymandering in our state and put citizens in charge of drawing congressional districts and legislative districts. That then led to a coupled initiative that same year in 2018 to expand voting in our state. When I took office, you had to register to vote 30 days ahead of time. You had to request and have an excuse or reason to vote from home or in any other way other than on election day itself. And so voters, through citizens initiative, transformed our democracy. I was just fortunate enough to be able to be elected as the state's chief election administrator in that same election, where all of the policies I would have wanted to push for at that moment, I was elected and took office getting ready to implement. And it was really incredible. That to me was, a moment that was transformative for our democracy. I spent the years after implementing all those changes, and we saw after we did that, no reason absentee voting, election day registration, automatic voter registration, citizen-led redistricting. Then, lo and behold, you see the highest turnout in our state's history just 2 years later in 2020, in no small part due to those election laws that made it easier for everyone on both sides of the aisle to participate. And then we saw another expansion in 22, but with the citizens drawn districts in 22, we saw what fair districts actually generate, which are people who represent the demographics and the political balance in the state. And that is really how you saw a more people-driven policy structure in our state. It started with people expanding their access to democracy themselves through the initiative process. And all of us as administrators, as elected officials, our job is simply to make their will real.
Yeah, I think you're selling yourself short. I always have this image of, and you hear this, like really good mayors. They like
Mm,
drive up and down the streets looking for potholes.
mm,
The reason why I wanted to talk to you is that, I just have this image of you every day, like sort of doing the equivalent of driving up and down the streets looking for potholes, except for voters, right? Like trying to figure out like what are the friction points that
yeah.
voters face? What are the things that maybe were well intentioned, but just like they are just tripping people up, or the election officials are just having to go through an extra step, and it's just like creating a little bit more turbulence. And so this, like I said, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you. What is that motivation about? Because, frankly, there are a lot of Democrats who are like, we won, we're in charge, we don't really have to do a lot more.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's just a real belief that in the power of the people, and a real respect for their voices, and a real desire to hear them heard, and also a recognition that all of the other issues, whether it's good education or potholes being fixed, or access to quality healthcare, everything else that I believe in comes to fruition when voters are engaged in demanding it. And that's what history teaches us, has led the way for some of the best policies we've seen throughout our country and our state's history. So it's really just a real love of ensuring that people feel their own power, that they're promised in a democracy, and that they can exercise it, and a respect for the promise that if we do that, then a lot of the other challenges and promises that we have can come to fruition. And in some ways, I never really made this connection before, but in thinking about it now, my parents as teachers, I heard stories about how hard it was for them to get their bosses, their leaders, the principals to listen to them, and that they kind of knew what was best for their students, but the principals would always like override their decisions or not listen to them. And so I think it's sort of a very deep sense of growing up, seeing how much teachers knew what was best for their students, and now really believing that voters know what's best for their communities, and that leaders are best when they listen to them and work with them to, make data-driven policy decisions and all the rest. But at the same time, a leader, whether it's a principal at a school or a governor of a state, can't really make the best informed policy decisions without having your ear to the ground and seeing what that experience is really like, what the needs really are for the people you serve.
Okay, so you mentioned at the outset that you feel like there were a lot of lessons learned from 2020. Just to remind everyone, you were attacked by then President Trump, now candidate Trump, for advocating expanded mail-in voting. You had to deal with a fake elector scheme in Michigan. The Republican Party of Michigan is now, seemingly controlled by a lot of election deniers. But even in 2020, you had to deal with really the first certification, challenge. Everyone now is very focused on this question of like election deniers refusing to certify election results. It was in your state, first in Wayne County, where Donald Trump and the then RNC chair called the two Republican members of the Wayne County Board of Canvassers to try to prevent them from certifying the outcome of the election results in that county. For people who don't know, Wayne County includes Detroit. And then at the state level, there was then a renewed effort when that failed to get the two Republican members of the state board of canvassers to refuse to certify the election results. So there was a lot that you dealt with in 2020 that was, let's say, unusual, ahistoric, historic. And I'm just curious, like, what did you take away from all of that?
It's actually was the darkest moment of that post 2020 election era for me. It wasn't when people showed up outside my home with guns. It wasn't when, Trump was pressuring others to attack me, or Giuliani pressuring folks. It was really that night of the Wayne County Board of Canvassers meeting, because we had been up to that point doing everything we can to protect those election results. And we knew about the pressure that those local certifiers were under. We knew two of them were probably not going to vote to certify. And there was nothing I could do in that moment to get them to do their job, to get them to do the right thing, to follow the law. We had a plan to go to court, to compel certification. The law provides for bad actors in that regard, and it does even more so now. So we knew that we would win the day because the votes as recorded on paper ballots were quite clear. But I remember coming home that night and thinking they won this round because And it was a critical round for them because, as you said, it was the first challenge, real challenge to certification. The goal and the scheme at the time, which has now been made quite clear, was to block certification at Wayne County, use that to block certification at the state level in Michigan. And though court cases would play out to ultimately compel certification, it would create this air of uncertainty that they could take to other states like Pennsylvania, which was going next, and a talking point to leverage and push other states not to certify, thereby opening up enough confusion and chaos to allow the alternate slate of electors to be potentially accepted by Mike Pence on January 6th. So that whole plan to overturn the election began with trying to block certification in Wayne County, which is why you saw the then president pressuring these, unknown civil servants. So we knew all that. And it was really eating me up that we hadn't won that round. But what happened that night was that hundreds of citizens showed up virtually and in person to sort of cogently, clearly state what the law was, what their legal duty was as canvassers and certifiers, and to say, count my vote, my voice matters, do your job. And lo and behold, that was actually what preserved that certification. That's what compelled those individuals who had been pressured by a president not to certify. The people showed up and compelled them to certify, to do their jobs on the strength of the voice of these citizens, these voters who simply said, my voice matters and I need you to make sure the vote is certified. So it's a beautiful story of the 2020 election about how it was really, we as officials did what we could, but had those citizens not showed up in that moment, the other side, the bad guys trying to undo election results, would have had a much stronger case going into what was to follow. And citizens really stood guard and ensured that certification did happen in Wayne County, did the same thing to compel certification at the state level as well. Again, with the law and the facts and the truth all on our side, was when the people stepped up to remind people in power of their jobs, that their jobs were done, and the election ultimately was certified in Michigan and then in every other state.
We'll be back with more of my discussion with Secretary Benson in a moment, but I want to say thank you for helping us reach over 150,000 subscribers on YouTube. As a sign of our appreciation, we're offering a discount on all Democracy Docket merchandise. Use code DDYT10 for 10% off all of our merch on the site. The link is in the description below. So I'm curious because I recall obviously what happened in Wayne County and then at the state board level. It sounds like you were less concerned about them succeeding at the state level than you were at the Wayne County level. And I'm just curious.
I was most concerned about Wayne County. We didn't know yet it was just a bunch of unknowns ahead of us at that time. We didn't know how it would play out. We just knew what the tools that we had in our toolbox, most importantly, the law and the facts of the election results. And so we're trying to figure out how to leverage them. What we didn't account for was just how powerful it would be for citizens to, on their own, decide to show up and say, that's not okay. You have to certify our voice and our votes. When we got to the state that day, up until the votes were taken, we did not know if Aaron Van Langerfeld would do his job or not.
And he was, just so that people...
Yes. There were 4 members of the State Board of Canvassers at the time, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. 1 Republican did not vote to certify. The 2 Democrats did, and it came down to 1 vote. That was Aaron Van Langerfeld, who was the then counsel to the speaker, the Republican speaker in the state house, legal counsel. He's a lawyer. So, he also knew the consequences. He knew the law, and he listened to the facts. But we did not know, and he did not reveal what his vote was going to be until he cast it. And then he, of course, cast to certify the election. But I was watching just like everyone else to see whether or not the facts and the rule of law would rule the day. And thankfully they did. But it really emphasized just how much democracy and protecting and preserving democracy depends on people of integrity in all positions, doing the right thing and following the law and respecting the will of the people.
And of course, after Michigan in 2020, we saw efforts by election deniers to refuse to certify in other states. There was an effort in Cochise County, Arizona, that my law firm sued over. There were efforts in Pennsylvania in a handful of counties. I think there was actually a further effort in Michigan, as I recall, in a county.
Mm-hmm. Yes, even just recently in northern Michigan, there was a county after a local election that hemmed and hawed over certifying. And myself and the Attorney General quickly reminded them what the law requires, which we'll do again. I mean, that's sort of what is amazing to me about all of this and what 2020 showed is that, the law is very clear. You have a responsibility to certify the election results if you're in those positions. If you abdicate that responsibility, we will seek consequences. We will enforce the law. And we've tried to be very clear about that. There's really no benefit to succumbing to perhaps political pressure and not doing your job and certifying. You're not going to be successful. We'll get the election results certified. And what will happen also is that, there will be legal consequences for the individuals who violated their oath and their responsibility.
So obviously, this is very much in the news because of not just the states we've talked about and what happened in 2022, but obviously there's a bit of drama around this going on in Georgia, but not only in Georgia. I mean, most prominently in Georgia, but not only in Georgia. And, there have been a number of articles that suggest that there are more election deniers that have, whether you say infiltrated or been inspired, whatever, but have gotten into local election administration, either in the counting of votes or the running of elections or in the certification of elections. And I'm just curious, obviously you can't speak to, other states and all that, but like, how much should people worry? Because people seem very worried. Like, how much should people worry that election deniers are going to be able to, influence the elections through these various schemes?
Well, I would say two things. One, for anyone feeling worried about this, so we have a saying in Michigan, we don't worry, we go to work. And I say that first just to emphasize that that whatever you might be worried about with regards to the election this fall, in this moment, use that worry to compel you to be a part of the solution. Meaning, in this certification piece, make sure if you are in a scenario where people with authority are choosing to not certify or essentially abdicating their responsibility in a very anti-democratic way, make sure you're at those meetings and not allowing them to break the law. Make sure you're speaking out about it. Make sure you're shining a light on it. We all can transform our worry and anxiety about this to play a role in making sure the law is followed and that people do their jobs. So see your role in that. One. Two, I think in addition to that, there are so many of us in every one of the battleground states or any of the states where this could happen with our eyes on this than there were before. The extent to which people would try to block certification in 2020, I think. Now, Marc, you have a unique ability to see and predict and be there in the fight when it happens. But I think for a lot of people, whether you saw it, I don't know, but a lot of us didn't and didn't anticipate it. Now we do, right? Now we're prepared. In some cases, like Michigan, we have stronger laws. In some cases, like Georgia, they are more complicated. But I think we are all, and there's whole organizations that are focused on this particular part of the process. So I think it's going to be much harder legally, practically, realistically for anyone to not certify and get away with it. Essentially, if they don't like the election results, we'll be there the second it happens to push for the law. And I believe that the law on all fronts will be followed. But you can't forget that important role that we as citizens, that all citizens have in compelling important people to do their jobs in important moments. And so I think we all have to have our eyes on this issue. And I think we do to a far greater extent than we did in 20. But every one of us has a role in making sure not only that we vote, but that we're part of making sure we protect the election results as well, knowing there are bad actors out there who would rather us stay silent, not vote, and then not be engaged in protecting our vote after the fact.
I want to ask you about what Republicans are up to. One of the hallmarks of this election cycle nationally has been a absolute explosion of litigation by Republican Party organizations, by right of center groups, to use the courts to try to restrict voting rights. I think that most people probably, when you were working in Alabama, most people thought that, the people who would go to court about voting were trying to expand the franchise, right? They were
Mm.
trying to do the things they could do to ensure that every eligible citizen is able to vote and that their vote counts and is accurately certified. And, people could have disagreements around whether this was the right lawsuit or that was the right lawsuit, the right strategy, the right legal theory or not, but that it was sort of all marching in the right direction. And one of the things that is very different about 2024 than even 2020 has been just the absolute onslaught of litigation that election officials like yourself and states are facing, by, like I said, by right-wing organizations or Republican Party that are avowedly trying to make it harder to vote. Like there's not a pretense to it. They're not trying to make it easier to vote for a different group of voters or voters they may think are more sympathetic. They're literally just trying to make it harder to vote. And the example that I just find the most like outrageous, that like kind of illustrates all of this, is a lawsuit that has been brought to essentially restrict the VA from registering voters in Michigan, presumably who are veterans, right? Because they're at the VA. And I'm just curious, how do you stay sane about this? How do you process it? How disruptive is it? I'm not going to ask you to get into the merits of the cases because that's, I'm sure you're going to say they're ongoing litigation, but like, what do you make of this?
I think it's astounding to me. Not just veterans, but small business owners, both of whom we've developed historic partnerships with federal agencies that I'm really proud of, to very simply just get information about voting to the citizens that these agencies serve. That's it. And all citizens, regardless of background, regardless of political position, regardless of how someone's going to use their vote, we want everyone to know and have access to it. And it's amazing to me, but really just underscores again the depths to which people will go to try to create this sense of illegitimacy, a sense that laws are being violated, and really just intimidate agencies like mine, agencies like the VA, from making sure people's voices are heard and the people that we serve have access to their votes and the ability to vote. I mean, the bottom line is, I think helping veterans, military service members, and their families register to vote is a great thing. It shouldn't be controversial. The fact that the Republican National Committee has made it such, and as well as many Republican members of Congress, really says more about them than us. And I'm proud to be on the side, I guess you could say, of making sure veterans, of which my husband is one, military service members, spouses, that they can register to vote when they come to the VA, and they can also receive election information and assistance. I think it should be our duty to do just that, and meet people where they are and provide government services in a way that's convenient, particularly when it's about accessing your fundamental right to vote. So we'll see how the lawsuits themselves play out. But what they're really doing is trying to create controversy over what is actually a nonpartisan, well-designed effort to engage more people in the political process, regardless of how they're going to vote. And it's been quite shocking to me. I've even heard from other Republican secretaries of state accusing me of, I don't know, some sort of wrongdoing. It's not even clear. You can't even, because there is nothing, right? But it's amazing to me how far and how deep this sense of intimidation is going, because the bottom line is it should not be controversial to simply make it easier for veterans and members of the small business community to register to vote and participate in the political process.
Yeah, and by the way, I didn't add, but I should. You mentioned the small business community. These are not traditionally Democratic leaning communities. I mean,
No.
the Republican National Committee is suing literally to prevent two agencies that serve really nonpartisan, bipartisan, but not necessarily left of center leaning constituencies. And you deserve an enormous amount of credit. This is what I mean about like riding around. I just envision you like riding around being like, oh, wait, we can get the
That
small
was a great
business
idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's go do that. You
We have
mentioned,
partners with like NASCAR. We're partners with the Detroit Lions. Like, this is what we do. We partner with organizations that meet people where they are and say, hey, while you're here, why don't you register to vote? I think every election official and secretary of state should be doing that. And it really just underscores this moment that we're in, that it's become controversial to really just do our jobs.
yeah, and so I want to ask you. You mentioned that you heard from some Republican secretaries of state. It wasn't that long ago that I felt like the National Association of Secretaries of State, the bipartisan group of secretaries of state, was actually like pretty functional. Like you had a lot of swapping of good election
Yeah.
and voting ideas across jurisdictions. You had, let's remember, Florida was one of the states that pioneered, vote by mail. It had early voting. It has early voting. You had Republican Secretary of State, Republican states like Utah adopt vote by mail. It didn't used to be that the Trey Grayson, the former Secretary of State of Kentucky, was always a big advocate of more of voting in a state that was traditionally harder to vote. So you had Republicans who were very much sharing ideas with Democrats, and you, by the way, had some Democrats who were not particularly great on voting back then. It was just a bipartisan mix, and it does feel to me that that terrain has shifted under you. That there is less of that going on, that organizations like ERIC, which is, ERIC, for people who don't know, it's an intra-state compact of states to essentially share voter data information to make sure voter rolls are kept clean, among other things it does. This is not a particularly democratic or left of center idea. It's just a good housekeeping way to help states administer elections. And you saw a bunch of Republican secretaries of state pull their states out of ERIC, even though that means dirtier voting rolls in their states. And so I'm just curious, am I reading the room collectively correct, or is there more bipartisanship still left?
In May of 2019, myself and the Alabama Secretary of State at the time, John Merrill, developed a bipartisan coalition of secretaries of state, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats. And we went to Selma, Alabama, and we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge together. It was the first time that had ever happened. It was an incredible weekend that we spent together, really exactly as you said, just developing. We don't always agree on the particular, but we could agree that we had a duty to make sure everyone could vote, and an understanding of the history of folks who had stood in the way of that, and collectively deciding we wanted to be on the side of democracy, on the side of helping everyone vote. I had Republican secretaries at the time in tears say, now I really understand what voter suppression is about. It was a beautiful trip. It was amazing and truly bipartisan. You can look back now to the people who were on that and your jaw would drop because you would never see a trip like that happen today, even with those same people. And that's what to me is so sad about how I thought at the very least, we as professional election administrators would hold in this moment, and that organization as a professional election administration organization, NAS, would hold and not be overrun by partisan influence. And that is not what has happened. And it really is sad because what we've lost is an opportunity to collaborate and share and support each other. But it really, the turning point for me came in 2020 when Brad Raffensperger, Republican Secretary of State, did his job famously. Georgia. Yeah. Famously, through a phone recording, was pressured by the president of the United States, Donald Trump, to find 11,000 votes. He said no, did his job to great, both celebration and controversy. And only one Republican Secretary of State after that occurred, Kim Wyman, who was then in Washington. She was the only one on the Republican side that spoke out in support of what he did. And I was shocked. Intentionally after the election was like, hey, everyone, let's get together and put out a statement. It's just bipartisan statement, reaffirming, standing with our guy in Georgia, making sure he feels he's not alone because he's getting attacked right now. And we as election officials, every single one of us should be able to say as secretaries of state, we would have done the same thing that he did and stand with him. And I couldn't get a single Republican secretary to sign on to that except for Kim. And it was, for me, the first moment when I knew things were different now. And, I still can't, it still blows my mind that it was a heavy lift, if not an impossible one, to get other Republican secretaries to sign on to something like that. In support of Brad Raffensperger for saying, no, I'm not going to find 11,000 votes after the Georgia presidential election. So that kind of shows you how things have shifted. And I think your observation is right on.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but I have to ask you. So the biggest question I get from the most people is they feel powerless They say, Marc, you talk to Secretary Benson and she sounds amazing. She's doing all these things and you are amazing. And everyone owes you a debt of gratitude, not just in Michigan, but around the country. But what can I do as a citizen? I'm just a person who, wants to make a difference. What is it that you tell? I'm sure people must come up to you all the time and ask this, what is it that people who are concerned about our democracy, they are already registered, they're going to vote, but what else can they do to help make your job easier, your colleagues' jobs easier, elections work better, democracy work?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all. And it always is it. I think the bottom line is the people who feel powerless actually have the most power. And you have to remember that. Take that feeling of powerlessness and dismiss it, because that's what people who are against democracy want you to feel. So if you feel that, they are winning, and we cannot allow that. Because the reality is you have more power. What that Wayne County Board of Canvassers story underscores is that the people have more power, even than election officials, to protect democracy in this moment. So stand in that power. Know that power you have as citizens, which is far greater in a democracy than anyone else's when you're working together to push forward. And so the three things I would recommend is, number one, know the rules of voting in your state, and to a certain extent, other states as well. And that may seem relatively simple, but misinformation takes hold in a vacuum. It takes hold when there's a blank slate of information about the certification process, about the voting process, about how paper ballots are counted. So know going into this fall, that every one of the battleground states, every voter will be voting on paper ballots, that there are audits after the fact to count those paper ballots, know and understand all the intricacies of voting, so that step two, when the misinformation hits, you can be a voice for truth, a democracy ambassador. In Michigan, we've actually established a democracy ambassador program where any citizen can sign up to get weekly newsletters about the intricacies of voting and elections in our state, so that you can be that knowledgeable expert as a citizen and be that ambassador for truth when the misinformation hits. So when you see misinformation or you see attacks around our voting process, go to entities like PolitiFact and a number of other websites that we can get you, or just your local secretaries of state office or local clerk's office, to debunk misinformation and get the truthful information out. So know the facts, debunk the misinformation, and be committed to doing those things, because that is what will actually help us protect against the biggest threat to election security today, which is voters being fooled about the rules of voting and the very specific process we have in place in states like ours, multi-layered, to protect the security of the results and make sure they're accurate. And then finally, the third thing I would say is, this election is going to define the future of our country for generations to come. And really make your vote and the work you do between now and November a reflection of that seriousness, a reflection of the fact that we all have a responsibility to defend who we are in this country in this moment. There are people on the ballot who have already shown us who they are in regards to their respect for the will of the people and the democratic process. And so we do have to think through, as Adam Kinzinger said at the Democratic National Convention, I know we're not partisan, but all that, he really made the case quite clearly that this is more than an election. This is a moment for our country. And as voters, we have to be a part of ensuring everyone knows that no matter what someone's party is, we have to elevate leaders who will speak the truth and respect citizens and our voice and our votes. And this is our moment to show as a nation that we're committed to doing that. And that's why we all have the power in this moment to do all those things. And it is the most important thing that we as citizens can do for these next few months.
Well, Secretary Benson, you are a hero of mine. You're a hero of everyone in this country who cares about democracy. And the number of people who just come up to me on the street or send me emails or messages who tell me how inspired by you they are would amaze you. I'm sure you get it directly as well, but you
a lot
deserve
of threats, Marc.
Well,
the swatting, the people, that's my world. But
okay, well, know that there are people out here who love the work you do and admire you every single day. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks. That means a lot. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all your work as well to be a champion for democracy. You're a hero as well, and grateful to be here with you today.
Thanks. Thanks for joining. To stay up to date on the latest voting rights and democracy news, please make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. We'll see you next time. Defending Democracy is a production of Democracy Docket LLC.